Hanging on by a thread, the intersection between domestic abuse and poverty in the United States of America. Domestic abuse accounts for 21% of all violent crimes in the United States, and research estimates that 25% of all women will experience domestic violence at some point in their lives. One such woman is Alice. Alice is a mother of 2 children, both from 2 separate abusive relationships, and could have been a mother of 3, but the father of her second child beat her so badly that she lost that 3rd pregnancy. Alice described her abusive exes as possessive and controlling, and this experience resonates with most other women who face domestic violence. Alice was able to escape her 2 abusive exes and work to take care of herself and her children, but this is where her experience diverges drastically from other poor women who find themselves in abusive relationships. Poverty perpetuates domestic abuse for women in the United States and keeps them trapped in and returning to abusive households because of financial reasons, childcare concerns, and societal perspectives of poor women. The primary concern regarding domestic abuse and poverty is that the women are unable to leave their abusive relationships due to a lack of financial resources. There are 3 main drivers behind this: a partner's insistence to enforce women's domesticity, primary childcare responsibilities, and early childbearing. But even poor women who do manage to escape abusive households find themselves right back with their abusive partners after a short while. The main sources perpetuating this are lack of vocational skills, lack of familial support, responsibilities for dependent children, lack of intervention, and the work requirements in welfare programs. Each of these factors interconnect to create a web that keeps poor women entrapped in abusive relationships. First, early childbearing has a detrimental impact on a woman's finances and future possibilities in the workplace. In a study done with 40 women who were part of the Work First program, which is a program designed to assist recipients of Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, or TANF, in developing job skills, becoming employed, and moving towards self-sufficiency. Researchers found that most women who had previously been part of abusive relationships had also experienced teen pregnancies. This is because early childbearing leads to detrimental disruptions in educational opportunities for young girls, and it obstructs their ability to participate in the workforce, since these girls now have to dedicate an extensive amount of time to caring for an infant. This makes poor women particularly vulnerable to abuse because it leads them to economic dependency, either on the father of their child or on another abuser who promises to provide for them. The economic dependency ends up being the key to locking poor women away because without financial resources of their own or the ability to earn, these women have no choice but to suffer through abuse to be financially looked after. The childcare responsibilities associated with these children also serve to further perpetuate domestic abuse. Childcare is increasingly expensive due to the fact that the government does not allow or allocate sufficient resources for quality, adequate, and safe childcare, which means that more often than not, poor women need to stay at home to care for their children, in turn sacrificing their opportunity to earn enough to escape their abusive household. This is only exacerbated by abusive partners who enforce traditional feminine values on women and force them to manage the household and children instead of going to work. Their insistence to enforce these values is partly propagated by their fear that their girlfriends or wives will meet someone new and sexually betray them if they leave the house to work. As a result, victims are unable to work in order to become self-sufficient, and they lose out on the opportunity to develop job skills when they're forced to stay at home and look after children. This makes victims increasingly financially dependent on their abusers and increases their vulnerability to abuse. This problem pertaining the relationship between childcare, a woman's traditional role, and abuse stems even further to the legal system itself. The laws surrounding abuse are designed such that a mother has a legal duty of care towards her child to protect that child from harm, no matter the cost. This means that if a mother were to harm her child, she would, of course, be held legally responsible, but the father would face no criminal charges. On the other hand, if a father were to harm his child, the woman would still face a conviction for failing to protect that child from his father. This was the case of Hedda Nussbaum. Her husband, Joel Steenberg, severely abused and proceeded to kill their daughter, Lisa. However, both Hedda and Joel were arrested and charged for the crime. Law enforcement had noted that Hedda had a very small stature and was covered in bruises from the domestic abuse she faced from Joel, and a hospital visit later revealed fractured bones, including her skull and rib. However, this did not exonerate Hedda from the threat of prosecution unless she completely cooperated with law enforcement. This legal bind creates another reason for women to stay at home with their children. If their abusive partner were to harm any of the children, the woman could be held legally responsible for that. This motivator contributes to an abused woman's inability to work and gain financial independence. One may look at these facts and note that it's not necessary that these problems, other than expensive childcare, pertain only to poor women. Women of other classes face domestic abuse as well, and the aforementioned factors could just as easily perpetuate their abuse. Further, affluent women experiencing domestic abuse often have an additional fear, the fear for their lives. These women believe that their husbands can get away with a homicide since they usually have a tendency of getting away with other crimes, and this fear propagates the woman's sense of need to hide their abuse. While this may be true, research still indicates that women in poverty face higher rates of domestic abuse because of poverty-related stresses. Further, while affluent women do face domestic abuse, they often have the financial resources and social connections, that is, access to lawyers, support from their family, etc., to be able to escape their abuser, which is a luxury that poor women do not have. This essay in no way suggests that domestic abuse is any less severe or serious for a woman not struggling from poverty. It only argues that poverty entraps women in violent households and perpetuates their abuse in a way that it does not women of other classes. In fact, research suggests that even poor women who do manage to escape their abusive partners often end up returning to those partners for a variety of reasons. First, when victims leave abusive partners, they leave with their children and therefore have primary child care responsibilities. The reason that this drives the victim back to her abuser is that often a victim is unable to adequately care for the children herself. As previously mentioned, victims of domestic abuse are unable to learn vocational skills during the course of their violent relationships due to their inability to work and various disruptions to educational opportunities. This, along with the difficulty of finding affordable and safe childcare while they go to work, results in survivors being unable to gather enough money to adequately care for their children themselves. These survivors also have no one else to depend on to help them out. They're often estranged from family or friends, and more than 50% of the time, their abusive exes do not contribute in child support. One survivor, Rosie, recounted the financial struggles attempting to flee her abusive husband. She said, "At one stage, my daughter and I were on the farm. There was no food. That was one of the times I left him. We ate dog food. It tastes okay if you're hungry. I also stole potatoes out of the farmer's land and made mash with the dog food over it, with a little bit of salt. If you don't have food, it tastes very nice." Another woman, Kathy, said, "I'm trapped. I need to stay. I won't make it on my own with all the children. I also need the money from him." Therefore, poverty leaves survivors with the inability to provide sufficient childcare entirely by themselves, and it drives them right back to their abusers, where they know their children will be financially cared for to a greater degree. One source that a survivor could rely on to financially assist her when she leaves her abuser is welfare programs. TANF looks like it could be a lifeline for a survivor in that it can give her monetary aid to care for her children. However, this is not the case. The PRWORA, that is the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act, which is a part of TANF, eradicates an entitlement to receive benefits for qualified recipients. It establishes a maximum lifetime benefit of 5 years, and it establishes a work requirement for all recipients. This presents a problem to survivors of domestic abuse. Because of the previously mentioned reasons making it difficult for survivors to find stable employment, the work requirements under the PRWORA section off survivors from receiving any aid for their children. Thereby, these work requirements encourage women to return to their abusive relationships. There is, however, an exception for abused women granted by Congress, which is the FVO, or the Family Violence Option. This allows women who meet its established criteria to receive aid without having to comply with the work requirements and eradicates any maximum lifetime benefit limits for these women. One may argue that this allows for the provision of aid to abused women and is sufficient in keeping them away from their abusive partners. However, that's not true. There are very few families that actually receive waivers under the FVO, disproportionately fewer than the number of women who require it. This is largely due to lack of information. Many TANF recipients do not know that they have a right to request a waiver, nor do they understand the impact that domestic violence has on their receiving TANF benefits. Further, in some states, over 70% of TANF applicants aren't screened for domestic abuse at all. This lack of information means that FVO is useless to most victims because without knowing about its existence, they cannot benefit from its assistance. Further, even if victims of domestic violence were informed of the FVO, there are very few people in poverty that actually receive TANF at all. Out of every 100 families in poverty, only 21 received TANF benefits in 2020. In order to qualify for the FVO, a victim must first be eligible to receive TANF, and with its low rates, it's unlikely that many victims would qualify for it. Therefore, even the FVO proves unable to assist abused women in escaping their partners. The other hurdle that sends poor women back to their abusive partners is the lack of intervention programs assisting poor survivors of domestic abuse. Research gathered by the Society for Personality and Social Psychology suggests that people tend to view poor or marginalized women as tougher than their wealthier counterparts. People perceive these women as having gone through a lot of challenges in life and as a result having a tougher personality, which equips them with the ability to deal with domestic abuse or other such issues, for example harassment, without much societal intervention. This creates problems that stem not from society's unwillingness to help poor women, but rather its belief that poor women don't require any help at all. For example, when evaluating cases of workplace harassment, the same harassing behaviors are viewed as less harmful when a blue-collar woman experiences them than when a white-collar woman does. This perspective discourages assistance for poor victims of domestic abuse, and therefore when they ultimately end up needing someone to rely on to help care for themselves and their children, they have no choice but to turn back to their abusive partners. Poverty thereby perpetuates domestic violence for women by creating impediments towards their independence through financial, social, and legal means, and it keeps them entrapped in their violent relationships. The current methods in place to assist these women in escaping their relationships, that is, financial assistance programs like the FVO, aren't working the way they were intended because of the fact that many women that require it don't receive TANF, and of the ones that do, most don't know that they're eligible for FVO. Other intervention programs are scarce to come by due to the societal perspective that poor women are tougher. It seems clear that financial struggles and the lack of financial independence is the main factor in keeping women entrapped in violent relationships. It is therefore key for a solution to this problem to help better a victim's financial situation in some way. My suggestion is to have welfare for survivors of violence be a separate program entirely instead of being attached to TANF. This new welfare program should provide monetary assistance to victims attempting to flee their abusive partners, and it should provide educational and vocational training for survivors in order to make them financially self-sufficient. However, participation in the latter shouldn't be a requirement to receive monetary assistance, but rather should be optional because, as highlighted earlier, placing such restrictions can worsen a victim's condition and drive her back to her abuser. Now, while this lack of requirements may cause the proposed welfare program to be less politically feasible, I maintain that there should be no such requirements. This is because the goal of a welfare program designed to assist survivors of domestic violence should be to ensure that the woman it aids doesn't have to experience that violence again. Not only do forced participation requirements drive a woman back to her abusive relationship, which is counterintuitive to the program, but they also mimic certain conditions of domestic violence in that they make a woman's financial security conditional on a program for which she has to sacrifice a lot. It would be unethical if a program claiming to help survivors of domestic violence makes it harder for them to escape their abusive household by taking away the sense of freedom that they earned by escaping in the first place. Therefore, The only requirements to be eligible for the proposed welfare program should be that a person is a victim of domestic violence and that the person lives below or very close to the poverty line. Such a program can help mitigate the factors that perpetuate domestic violence for women in poverty and can therefore be an effective solution to this problem.